Ethan Sullivan stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars below him, and he felt nothing but emptiness despite everything he had built and the empire he commanded with an iron fist worth billions on paper, yet somehow feeling bankrupt in ways money could never fix. And he knew deep down that something vital had been lost along the way, though he refused to acknowledge it openly, even to himself. The intercom buzzed, breaking his reverie, and his assistant reminded him about his dinner reservation at Azure tonight with Jenna, and he nodded, though no one could see him, before grabbing his jacket from the leather chair and heading toward the private elevator that would take him down to street level, where his driver waited with the sleek black car that cost more than most people made in a year. Jenna was already in the car when he slid into the back seat, and she looked stunning as always, with her designer dress clinging to her curves and her blonde hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. But Ethan barely registered her appearance anymore because the novelty had worn off months ago, though he would never admit that either. And she leaned over to kiss his cheek, leaving a trace of lipstick that he wiped away absent-mindedly. They drove through the city in silence, except for Jenna scrolling through her phone and occasionally showing him posts from social media influencers she followed, and he nodded without really looking because his mind was elsewhere, wandering to places he had tried to lock away and forget, but memories had a way of breaking through even the strongest walls he had constructed around his heart. Azure was one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, with a waiting list that stretched months ahead. But Ethan never waited for anything, because money opened every door and bent every rule. And tonight was no exception, as they were ushered past the crowded bar area and through the dining room filled with chandeliers and the soft murmur of wealth exchanging pleasantries. The hostess led them to their usual table near the center of the room, where Ethan liked to be seen and admired and envied by those who recognized him from business magazines or financial news networks. And Jenna immediately pulled out her phone to take photos of the table setting and the menu and everything else she could capture for her followers who lived vicariously through her lifestyle. But then Ethan saw her, and everything else ceased to exist in that moment, because Claire was sitting at a corner table bathed in candlelight, and she was laughing in a way he had not seen in years, and the sound of it, even from across the room, hit him like a physical blow to the chest, making it hard to breathe. She looked different somehow, though he could not immediately place what had changed, except that she seemed lighter and more present, and genuinely happy in a way she had never been with him during their final years together. And her auburn hair caught the light as she leaned forward, listening intently to the man across from her. Lucas Grant, and Ethan recognized him immediately, because you did not run a billion-dollar company without knowing your competitors, especially ones who had been steadily eating away at your market share for the past 2 years. And seeing him with Claire felt like betrayal, even though Ethan had no right to feel that way anymore.
Ethan felt his jaw tighten as he watched Claire touch Lucas' arm while laughing at something he said, and the casual intimacy of the gesture made his stomach twist into knots because that used to be his privilege, and his alone, back when they were high school sweethearts, dreaming of futures that seemed so simple and attainable before money and power corrupted everything he touched. Jenna noticed his distraction immediately and followed his gaze across the restaurant until her eyes landed on Claire and Lucas, and she let out an exasperated sigh that Ethan barely registered because he was too busy watching Claire smile in that genuine way she used to smile at him before everything fell apart and before he made the choices that destroyed their marriage. The waiter approached their table, but Ethan waved him away without looking, and Jenna set down her phone with more force than necessary, making the silverware clink against the china, and she crossed her arms, waiting for him to acknowledge her presence, but he could not tear his eyes away from the woman he had once promised forever to, before breaking that promise in the worst possible way. Claire looked radiant, in a simple navy dress that hugged her figure without trying too hard, and she had let her hair grow longer than she used to wear it, and there was a confidence in her posture that had not been there during their final months together, when she had seemed to shrink into herself every time he came home late or not at all, and every time he chose work over her. Lucas was leaning in close now, saying something that made Claire throw her head back and laugh, And Ethan felt a surge of jealousy so intense it shocked him. Because he thought he had moved past this and moved past her, but apparently the heart does not care about logic or the passage of time or the new relationships we build to cover old wounds. Jenna finally spoke, and her voice was sharp with irritation, asking if he was going to stare at his ex-wife all night or actually acknowledge that she was sitting right here. And Ethan forced himself to look at her, but the words would not come, because what could he say that would make sense of the emotions churning inside him? He had been the one to cheat, and he had been the one to prioritize board meetings over anniversary dinners, and client calls over her tears, and business trips over being present in their marriage, and she had forgiven him repeatedly until the day she could not forgive any more and walked away with nothing but her dignity and tact. Claire had not asked for alimony, despite her lawyer advising otherwise, and she had not fought for the house or the cars or any of the material possessions he had accumulated during their 10 years together, and she had simply wanted out, and wanted to start over, and wanted to find herself again after losing so much of who she was in their relationship. Ethan had thought she would come crawling back within months, because Claire had always been the quiet one, and the dependent one, and the one who needed him more than he needed her, or so he had convinced himself. But a year passed, and then another, and she never called or texted or showed any sign of wanting him back. He had thrown himself into work even more obsessively after the divorce papers were finalized, and that was when Jenna entered his life at a charity gala where she was modeling for one of the sponsors. And she was beautiful and fun and uncomplicated in ways that Claire had become complicated toward the end, and he thought maybe this was what moving on looked like. But now, watching Claire with Lucas, he realized he had not moved on at all. He had simply been running from the guilt and the regret and the knowledge that he had destroyed the best thing that ever happened to him, and no amount of money or success or beautiful women could fill the void she left behind. Lucas reached across the table and took Claire's hand, and she let him. And Ethan felt something break inside his chest, because that simple gesture represented everything he had lost, and everything he had taken for granted, and everything he would never get back, no matter how much he wanted it. Jenna stood abruptly, and her chair scraped against the floor loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables, and she grabbed her purse with trembling hands and told Ethan she was going to the restroom, but they both knew she was giving him an ultimatum without saying the words. And he watched her storm away without trying to stop her, because he could not pretend anymore. Claire had not noticed him yet, and she was too absorbed in her conversation with Lucas to scan the room, and Ethan was grateful for that small mercy because he did not know what he would do if their eyes met, and he did not trust himself to remain composed if she looked at him with indifference, or worse, with pity. Lucas was everything Ethan had tried to be in the early days of building his company, and he was charismatic and attentive and clearly successful, but he also seemed genuinely interested in what Claire was saying, and he listened without checking his phone or glancing around the room for more important people to network with, and that attention, that presence, was something Ethan had stopped giving Claire years before their marriage ended. The waiter returned, and Ethan ordered scotch without looking at the menu, and when the man asked about food, Ethan told him to bring whatever the chef recommended, because he had lost his appetite the moment he saw Claire, and nothing was going to bring it back. The waiter retreated quickly, sensing the tension radiating from the table. Ethan pulled out his phone, more as a defense mechanism than anything else, and he scrolled through emails without reading them, and his mind kept replaying moments from his marriage, and the time Claire had surprised him at the office with homemade lunch, only to find him too busy to eat with her, and the anniversary when he had canceled their dinner reservation for an emergency meeting that could have waited, and the night she had cried, telling him she felt invisible while he assured her she was overreacting. He had called her dramatic and oversensitive and needy, and he had made her feel small for wanting basic consideration and respect, and he had gasoline on a fire that was consuming their relationship until there was nothing left but ashes and regret and divorce papers signed with shaking hands. Claire laughed again, and the sound carried across the restaurant, cutting through the ambient noise and conversation, and it struck Ethan that he could not remember the last time he had made her laugh like that, and certainly not in the final 2 years of their marriage, when every interaction had become a minefield of resentment and disappointment. Lucas signaled the waiter and ordered champagne, and Ethan watched as the bottle arrived and glasses were poured, and Lucas raised his glass in a toast and Claire clinked hers against his, and they drank while gazing at each other with an intimacy that spoke of inside jokes and shared secrets, and a connection that went beyond business dinners. Jenna returned to the table, and her eyes were red-rimmed, though she had reapplied her makeup, and she sat down heavily and immediately drained the water glass in front of her before looking at Ethan with an expression that was equal parts hurt and anger and exhaustion, and she told him quietly that she could not do this anymore. Ethan knew she meant more than just tonight. She meant the constant comparisons to Claire, and the way he still kept photos hidden in his office desk, and the way he sometimes called her by his ex-wife's name in moments of distraction, and the way he held part of himself back no matter how much she tried to reach him. But before he could respond, and before he could figure out what to say to salvage this moment, or this relationship, or this evening that had gone so terribly wrong, Claire stood from her table and turned toward the restroom, and her eyes swept across the dining room and landed directly on Ethan, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The recognition in her eyes was immediate, and she froze mid-step, and her expression shifted from surprise to something unreadable. And Ethan felt his heart hammering in his chest, and he wanted to look away, but he could not. And they stared at each other across the crowded restaurant while years of history and pain and unspoken words hung in the air between them. Claire recovered first, and her face smoothed into polite neutrality, and she offered a small nod of acknowledgement before continuing toward the restroom. And Ethan watched her walk away and noticed how she held her head high, and how her stride was confident, and how she did not look back. And he realized in that moment that she truly had moved on. Lucas had noticed the exchange, and he turned to see who had captured Claire's attention. And when his eyes met Ethan, there was a flicker of recognition and understanding, and perhaps a hint of challenge, and the two men regarded each other like rival predators assessing territory and threat level. Jenna had seen everything, and she stood again, and this time she did not bother with excuses, and she simply told Ethan that he needed to figure out what he wanted, because she was done being second choice to a woman who did not want him anymore. And then she left, and Ethan sat alone at the table he had reserved to show off his new life.
Ethan sat alone, nursing his scotch and watching the ice melt in the amber liquid while his mind raced through scenarios of what he could say to Claire if he approached her table. And each imagined conversation ended badly, with her dismissing him, or worse, looking at him with the kind of pity reserved for people who have thrown away everything valuable in pursuit of nothing meaningful. Claire returned from the restroom, and her composure was perfect as she made her way back to Lucas, and she'd not glance in Ethan's direction, not even once, and that deliberate avoidance hurt more than any confrontation could have, because it meant he no longer registered as important enough to acknowledge, and he had become just another face in a crowded restaurant. The waiter brought their entrees, and Ethan watched as Lucas and Claire shared bites from each other's plates, and that simple act of intimacy and trust made Ethan remember when he and Claire used to do the same thing back when they were young and poor and happy in ways that had nothing to do with money or status. Ethan's phone buzzed with messages from Jenna, and he could tell from the previews that she was angry and hurt and done with his inability to let go of the past. And he should have felt something about losing her, but all he felt was numbness and a growing obsession with the woman sitting across the restaurant who had once been his entire world. He had proposed to Claire on the beach where they had their first date, and she had cried happy tears and said yes without hesitation, and they had married young, with nothing but love and dreams and student loan debt, and for a while that had been enough, and they had been enough for each other. But then his company took off, and success came faster than either of them anticipated, and suddenly there were investor meetings and business trips and opportunities that demanded his constant attention. And Claire had been patient at first and understanding and supportive, but patience has limits, and understanding has boundaries, and support eventually withers without reciprocation. She had started her own career as an art teacher at a local high school, and she had loved it, and she would come home with stories about her students and their progress and their breakthroughs. But Ethan had rarely listened and had been too consumed with profit margins and market share and beating competitors like Lucas Grant.
Claire had asked him to come to her school art show, and he had promised he would be there, but a last-minute conference call had run long, and he had missed it entirely. And when he finally arrived home that night, she had been sitting in the dark waiting, and the disappointment in her eyes had been devastating, but he had brushed it off and told her there would be other shows. Except there were not other shows, because after that night, something changed in Claire, and she stopped inviting him to things and stopped sharing her day and stopped expecting him to be present, and they had become roommates, living parallel lives that occasionally intersected at night when he remembered to come home. The affair had been stupid and meaningless, and he had convinced himself it was just physical, and just stress relief, and just something that successful men did when their wives did not understand the pressure they were under. But Claire had found out anyway, and the betrayal in her eyes when she confronted him had been like a knife to his chest. He had begged her to stay and promised to change, and sworn it would never happen again, and she had given him one more chance, and he had tried for maybe 3 weeks before falling back into old patterns because change required effort and self-reflection and admitting he was the problem, and those things were harder than making money. Claire had filed for divorce on their 10th anniversary, and the symbolism had not been lost on him, and she had done it quietly, without drama or public spectacle, and she had simply told him that she deserved more than he was capable of giving her, and she had walked away from everything they had built together. Lucas paid the check and held Claire with her coat, and they stood to leave, and Ethan felt panic rising in his throat because they were going to walk right past his table, and he would have to face her and face the reality of what he had lost and face the man who had somehow won what Ethan had discarded.
Claire and Lucas approached his table, and Ethan stood automatically, and his hands gripped the back of his chair until his knuckles turned white. And Claire stopped, and Lucas paused beside her with his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. And the three of them formed an awkward triangle of past and present and uncertain future. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but Claire beat him to it, and her voice was calm and polite as she greeted him and asked how he had been. And the casual tone of her question made it clear that whatever they had once shared no longer held emotional weight for her, and he was just someone she used to know. Lucas extended his hand and introduced himself, though they both knew who the other was, and Ethan shook it and felt the firm grip and saw the confidence in the other man's eyes and recognized that Lucas was not threatened by him and did not see him as competition because Claire had already made her choice. Ethan found his voice and asked Claire if she was happy, and the question came out more desperate than he intended. And she tilted her head slightly and regarded him with something that might have been compassion, and told him that yes, she was very happy, and then she thanked him for asking. Lucas mentioned that they should get going, and Claire nodded and started to turn away, but Ethan could not let her leave, and he reached out and touched her arm, and she stopped and looked down at his hand, and then up at his face, and waited for him to say whatever he needed to say. He told her he had made a mistake, and that he had been wrong about everything, and that losing her was the biggest regret of his life, and the words tumbled out without filter or planning, and he saw Lucas tense beside Claire, but she remained calm and collected, and when he finished, she took a deep breath. Claire told him that she appreciated his honesty, but that his regret did not change anything, and the past could not be undone, and she had spent 2 years rebuilding herself after their marriage ended, and she was not interested in going backwards, and she had finally found someone who valued her and respected her and made her feel seen. She explained that Lucas had come into her life when she least expected it, and he had shown her what a real partnership looked like and what it meant to be with someone who prioritized her happiness and made time for her and actually listened when she spoke, and she was not willing to give that up for nostalgia or guilt or belated apologies. Ethan felt tears burning behind his eyes, and he blinked them back and told her he understood, but asked if there was any chance and any possibility and any hope that they could start over and try again and do it right this time. And she shook her head slowly, and her expression was kind but firm. She told him that he needed to let her go, and that holding on to the past was preventing both of them from moving forward, and that she forgave him for everything, but forgiveness did not mean reconciliation, and sometimes love was not enough to overcome the damage that had been done, and they had both changed too much to go back. Lucas spoke then, and his voice was respectful but clear as he told Ethan that he cared deeply for Claire and intended to give her everything she deserved,
and he hoped Ethan could respect their relationship and move on and find his own happiness with someone else. Claire squeezed Ethan's hand briefly and told him to take care of himself. And then she and Lucas walked away the restaurant, and Ethan watched them leave together and saw Lucas open the door for her and saw Claire laugh at something he said and saw them disappear into the night. Ethan sat back down at his empty table and finally let the tears fall, and he realized that wealth and power and success meant nothing without someone to share it with. And he had learned this lesson too late and at too high a cost, and Claire was gone, and she was not coming back. The waiter approached nervously and asked if he wanted anything else, and Ethan shook his head and paid the check and left a massive tip and walked out into the cold night air alone. And he pulled out his phone and looked at messages from Jenna, and he knew he should call her and apologize, but instead he deleted her number and started walking. He walked for hours through the city he had conquered and built his empire in, and he realized that all the buildings and all the money and all the accolades were just monuments to his own emptiness. And Claire had been right all along, and he had sacrificed everything real for things that did not matter. By the time Ethan reached his penthouse, the sun was starting to rise, and he stood at those same floor-to-ceiling windows and watched the city wake up. And he understood finally that some mistakes could not be fixed, and some losses could not be recovered, and some loves only came once in a lifetime, and he had destroyed his.